Hello, and thanks for joining us today for understanding the role of CTO. This is the final webinar of our Defining the IC Career Ladder series. Today, we'll explore the many routes to becoming a CTO, what the day-to-day of a CTO looks like, and how the role differs depending on factors like team size, stage of the company, and specific industry challenges. Today's webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will head over to the LeadDev Slack to answer some of your questions in the Staff Plus channel. We may also have time for a couple questions live, so please do submit those through the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll get to them if we can towards the end. So let's start out with some introductions. My name is Jason Wong. I am the VP of Engineering for ActBlue. And today, I'll be joined by Arman Dadgar, CTO of HashiCorp, Elaine Zhou, CTO of Change.org, and Emily Castles, CTO of Boundless. Unfortunately, our fourth panelist, Vicki Wills, was not able to make it due to unforeseen circumstances. I'll go ahead and ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Arman, why don't we start with you?
Sure, and thanks so much, Jason, for having us and hosting us. My name is Arman Dadgar. I'm one of the co-founders of HashiCorp, along with Mitchell Hashimoto. We started the company way back in 2012, and it's been a long ride over the last 10 plus years. We got to take the company public last year, and we're very much in sort of the cloud infrastructure automation space. So, deep infrastructure, kind of core plumbing of enabling cloud automation and applications moving to cloud, and probably a little bit over 2,000 people or so today.
Wow, that's great. Thank you. Elaine.
Hi, thanks, Jason. My name is Elaine Zhou. I'm the CTO at Change.org, as many of you already know, and expecting many of you are the users. Change.org is the world's largest social change platform with over hundreds of millions of users in 196 countries and regions. My background is kind of a mix of startups and large companies, and so grateful to be in this panel, share my journey to the CTO role.
Awesome. And Emily?
Hey, everyone. Hey, Jason. Thanks for having me. So I'm co-founder and CTO at a company called Boundless. We're an operating system for your international team. So we help you solve all of your remote problems in terms of employment, etc. We founded 3 years ago, pre-pandemic, fully remote from the beginning, fully focused on remote problems. We're now 30 people. The product and engineering team is 7. And yeah, that's us at the moment.
Excellent. So excited to be chatting with you all today. I think just to get us started, it might be helpful just to go around the horn and for everyone just to give us some context around you a bit of the size, the stage your company is in, and what are your key responsibilities look like as a CTO? Emily, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I think I kind of touched on it a little bit there. We're 3 years into our journey. We're a growing company at this point in time. I've been there from the beginning. There's 30 people across the organization, and then within the product and eng team, that's 7, and that's my responsibility, that side of things. It creeps out of that area a little bit as well, because co-founder is, I think, a little bit different than just CTO. I think that comes with a little bit extra responsibility. And so, while I would say that my core responsibility really is connecting all the work that product and engineering team do to company level goals and strategy, etc. I definitely do a lot of other things in the organization, and that changes quite a lot from month to month and year to year.
Awesome. Arman.
Yeah, I mean, I joke that part of my job every 6 months is to figure out what my job is, because it feels like it changes so often. But I feel like it's a bit of a blend of things. So like I said, we're sort of a fairly large size. We're probably a little bit over 600 people in R&D, and so the sort of internals of the company, I have senior leaders who actually kind of run and operate kind of R&D on a more kind of day-to-day basis. So my role tends to be a little bit more high level, kind of as Emily said, there's sort of a co-founder additional set of responsibilities that come with it. So part of it's spending a lot of time with customers, helping them understand what's the vision, what's the roadmap, kind of where are we going. So spending time with kind of our large strategic customers, being sort of a face for our major partnerships. So you can imagine we spend a lot of time with big cloud partners, and so helping kind of be the technical face of that relationship. And then internally spending time with our sort of R&D leaders in terms of, great, what's the roadmap? What's the vision? How are we sort of driving to get there? How does that connect to the business priorities over the next, 12, 24 months? And then spending time as well outbound with sort of the investor community, helping sort of educate them about the company as well. So it's very much sort of a hybrid, internal facing, managing kind of product and vision, as well as external facing with partners and investors.
That's really interesting. Lots of questions. We'll follow up in a minute. Elaine.
Yeah, so my background is slightly different than you two as a co-founders, and I know that come with different responsibility. Currently my team is a little bit over 70 people, and overall about 100 people within the product development, including UX, product, and engineering. Since change has been for quite a few years, we are actually celebrating our 10 years anniversary as a global company. So some of the challenges is, how do we, started as a US company, corporation, how can we expand and move into the global world and continue facing all the challenges, as you tell, a lot of our business is directly impacted by external world, what's happening. So as the CTO, just combination managing people, process, but also working with other C-suites, members, and figure out what the company directions. At the same time, need to be extremely agile to make changes on a monthly, quarterly basis, based on different circumstances. Yeah.
That's great. I think what I heard a lot there was just it's a very sort of broad mix and match set of responsibilities. In terms of thinking about like how you spend your time, what percentage of your time do you spend on each? Like, how does it break down? Emily, we'll start with you.
Okay, so I think if you asked me this question a few years ago, it'd be very different to the answer now. I was very heavily involved with the technology in the early days. I was actually coding, etc. But there comes a point where that's no longer practical, and so I've kind of made that step maybe a year and a half ago. And so for me at the moment, I would say that a lot of my time is spent on business and people and process stuff over technical decisions, but the technical decisions that I do make and I'm involved with are the important pieces, if that makes sense. So like time spent might not be big, but impact is big, if that makes sense. And then, your day to day, you kind of like get pulled in various different directions around business and people stuff.
Awesome. Armin.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a hard one to answer because it kind of it evolves so much based on the kind of needs of the business. In some sense, I'd say it's gone through waves, right? To Emily's point, in the beginning, it was 100% hands-on keyboard, actually developing. Then I think your job became more of like you're the chief, recruiter in chief, if you will, of helping build the leadership team, and so you're maybe helping drive technical architecture, recruiting, things like that. Over time, I'd say sort of in the middle period, right, when we were able to bring in a VP Eng, VP product, it became much less focused operationally, much more focused outbound. So I spent predominant portion of my time with customers, partners, sort of evangelizing the business. So being very outbound focused. And then I'd say in the last year, it's sort of gone back to maybe a 50-50, where 50% of my time is sort of outbound, customers, partners, et cetera. And then 50% is maybe inward looking, both people management, process, vision setting, direction. So I think it evolves a lot just based on sort of what the needs of the business are, what your leadership bench looks like. It feels like it's very dynamic in that blend.
That's great. Elaine.
I will completely agree with both Emily and Armin said. Basically, I feel my time split in between people, process, technical, and product, and also general business. It really depends on the stage of the company in the role. When I first stepped into the CTO role before I joined Change, I think I will probably, it's a startup, I spend more time in a key technical decisions and the business directions. At Change, my first year, I would say first year and a half, my focus is actually people. It's from recruiting, building the teams. Now it's more focused on general business directions because we're expanding beyond our current advocacy, petition platforms and also key technical decision, but not necessarily hands-on as doing the research or doing the coding, but helping the team guide them to arrive to the decision.
Yeah, I often think about it as like, what are the like my job is sort of understanding how do we provide the capabilities or start developing the capabilities that we need, and then leaving sort of that execution layer to my director or some of my frontline managers. One of the things I'm really interested in is sort of this journey to the CTO office or the CTO seat. And I think about, what are maybe some of the defining moments in your career or an experience that you felt really prepared you well, or that gave you the confidence to take on this role of CTO? Armin, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. Yeah. So I'd say it's a very unusual path, to be honest. So in sort of my prior life, previous to HashiCorp, I grew up in sort of like application development land, and sort of my I guess you'd call me probably an application architect or something like that, principal engineer. And so that's kind of was my background, very much IC role. Used to sort of being a team lead, but not really a people manager, if you will. And so I think with HashiCorp, it was a different set of skills. And I think again, early days was very focused on being hands-on keyboard, being sort of a chief architect of the products. And I think by necessity, as the company grew, had to be a bit of a people manager, but quickly realized that wasn't my strength, right? And so sort of hired around that. That's when we brought in a VP of engineering, VP of product. And so they very much operated R&D on a day-to-day basis for many, many years. And so as a CTO, my role was still much more technical focused than it was running the org, right? It was much more about vision setting, helping be a lead to the leads, if you will, the tech leads, and being a sounding board on architecture, code reviews, those kind of product decision things. I think as the business continued to grow, then it was like, great, there was a chance to be more involved operationally again. But I think for me, it was always acknowledging that my strength was never the people leadership side. It was much more on the product vision and sort of company direction side. So always been kind of buttressed by people who have brought that strength and had many, many more years of experience managing teams than I have. So I think that's what sort of made this transition sort of, possible. It was sort of figuring out what the weaknesses are and sort of not trying to necessarily lean into those so much as lean into the strengths and bring in the right people around you to support the role.
Yeah, that is fantastic. I also think about like, what is like, how, when do you have that realization? Like, how did you come about like, oh, this is not my strength. I need to like, hire around me to buttress all these things.
I feel like once you've done your first, I don't know, I'll ask the rest of the group, but once you've done your first 20, 50 one-on-ones, it probably becomes clear whether you're like, this was meant for me or this was not meant for me. I think it was more, to me, I think the true tell is like, where do you get your energy from? And to me, where I really got my energy from was like, I loved getting my tech leads in a room and getting on a whiteboard and sketching through product vision, product architecture, versus when you get to like, oh, let's do performance reviews. It's sort of like the internal groan, a little bit of like, okay, it's like eating your vegetables, right? You're like, I know I got to do it. But it was not a source of energy.
Yeah, that's so good. Emily, what about you? What was a defining moment or experience?
I feel like everything that Armin says, I feel like I'm looking into my future in some ways because he feels like he's like ahead of me on this journey. So that's really interesting. But like, I don't think I've quite figured out where some of the things that Armin has figured out quite a lot. But I think like some of the defining experiences I suppose I've had is that I started out my career as a civil engineer and I worked in civil engineering for 10 years. And then I kind of didn't like the limitations of that career. And I needed something that was a little bit more kind of flexible and open-minded. And I identified tech as that thing. And so I retrained in computer science when I was 30. And so I came out as a 30-year-old graduate into the startup world. And I think that my previous experience kind of springboarded me into leadership in a way that probably might not have happened if I was doing it earlier or when I was younger. So, that experience it was technical engineering experience, but it was also people and managerial experience that I had from my previous role. And I think that really kind of set me up to be in those positions as a developer when I was in my earlier career. And then I'm very much an accidental CTO. Did not set out on this path. I had an ex-colleague approach me about Boundless, and I thought I would build some software. I very much was thinking I was going to go down the individual contributor route at that point. I really kind of wanted to step away from that, that pull between half managing and half developing. That had been my life for too long. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to go all in on developing. And then Dee Coakley, my co-founder, approached me and I was like, maybe I'll build your software. And then the more that I talked to her, like I couldn't step away from the concept of the company because it was really close to my heart. So it was really a decision to be co-founder and CTO. I know I keep saying that, but like that it's just true for me. So totally accidental. And I will say that in the first 6 to 12 months of this role, I Googled, what is a CTO? What does a CTO do? Like I 100%, was like figuring that out along the way, like very much not, prepared and ready for the job, like you might expect.
Emily, if it makes you feel better, I still Google that.
Yeah, I know. Totally. Like maybe 4 years. What is it? I don't know.
Well, I think that also brings up an interesting point, right? Like it's one thing to get the job, and then it's another to like actually be doing it. Elaine, from your experiences, like what have you found surprising about the role? Like in what ways have you had to adapt? What ways did you in unexpected ways?
Yeah, so my journey to CTO is slightly different than Emily and Armin as a co-founders. I actually come from very traditional, as the engineers and move up the ranks and chief architects, and I actually spent 5 years going back and forth as an engineering manager and architects and IC role because I couldn't design. I'm sure you can share. And finally, I realized my superpower is really to set the technical directions and vision and build a team to do it, and that helped me to move forward. And then the next key thing for me is designing. So I actually come from a traditional VP of engineering role, and then before stepping to the CTO. So the challenge for me is actually on the other side is I have been served quite a few times in startups and served the CTO who is, co-founders, no offense, and quite a few of them actually it's their first job or second job. It's, come from IC, just step in a role. So I came from different perspectives. The surprising for me in that experience is how much I need to lead, because I know that I got hired because they want me to focus on operational aspects. So I have to take care of all that part of the business. At the same time, I have to inject myself to participate on the table, participate in business and technology vision and strategy, because I have more experience than at the time a couple of my co-founders are, based on that backgrounds. And if I'm talking about a younger self, I would say that you actually step in, trust myself a little bit more to participate in that instead of actually wait until later. Because everyone, especially a startup, everyone come from a different experience and bringing our perspective to help out. I think that was the one thing. Now that as I have more people in the team, the surprises is really how you switch. And I still call myself and balance out when I should step in and have put in my strong opinions. No, don't go this direction, needs to do this from a technical standpoint, and when I really need to just let go and create a safe environment for the people to try it out. And it's safe to fail,
Oh, that's so good. I think for anyone sort of in management leadership, like the number of decisions that we're making on a daily basis can add up very quickly. I'd love to hear what are some of the most difficult types of decisions that you all have to make on a daily basis, or even in a quarterly or annual basis. Emily, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think that I find the most difficult decisions the ones that feel like they're very committing, that like you're making some kind of like a call technically that it's hard to reverse from. So where possible, I try to bring in some kind of experimentation so that we can test things out before making that decision. But that's definitely one that stands out to me. And then second to that is organizational design decisions. So, I think Elaine was alluding to that a little bit earlier as well, is like, you kind of have to set your strategy for hiring and kind of run with it and believe in it, I guess. And that feels quite committing as well. So I think that those kinds of decisions are the harder ones. But then if you kind of were to ask me on any given week, I think it's about volume rather than any one often, that sometimes you just kind of, you get to a point where there's so many decisions on your plate that, you know, some of them have to drop off, or it's just very difficult to make certain ones for that reason. So.
Yeah, totally. Like I can barely decide what I want for dinner at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah. Armin, how about you?
It's a good question. I mean, I guess I think about it as there's sort of the type 1 decisions, which you can kind of change course on, and the type 2 ones that are sort of one-way doors. I think the type 1s you have to learn to let go, because there's simply too many of them on a day-to-day basis. And you're like, you know what? I trust the team. If they get it wrong, we change course. I think the type 2s that tend to be harder and more stressful, right? Things like personnel ones, right? Where it's like, when do you really want to coach someone versus when are they the wrong person for the role? Those can be sort of hard questions, because especially the more senior that person, the bigger the collateral impact they have, right? Like at some point when they become the bottleneck to the business, those are hard decisions, because you're like, I like them. Can they be coached to the next level, or do you just need a different leader in seat? So those, I think, are fairly hard ones. I think resource allocation is always hard, especially when you're having to make a hard, probably some of the hardest choices we've ever made is when you're staring out the barrel of like, hey, this project's not working. Should we keep funding it? Or, do you defund this project? And that's kind of a one-way door, right? Because, probably you're going to have some team attrition. It's hard to rebuild momentum, et cetera. So I think some of those ones are around sort of resourcing, where you really say, you know what, great, do we keep putting good money after bad? I think those are hard, because to a degree you get emotionally attached, right? Oftentimes it's like you're invested in it. It's your baby. It's your idea. Do I really want to pull the plug on that thing?
Doesn't it come down to people then as well, right? Because like each of those things that are hard to make a decision on, it's because you're going to let somebody down, whoever it is in the organization, or whoever it is in your customers, right? There's somebody at the end of that decision that's going to feel your decision, and that's hard when that impact feels big. Then absolutely, it's difficult.
I joke about this all the time. I'm like, the T in CTO is actually therapy. Because it's like very little technical. You're mostly dealing with people.
I agree with everything that Emily and Armin said. The one thing I would add is also it's making the decision where to go next for the company when things are going well. When things not going well, sometimes your choices are limited, and then people are more willing to make bigger bets and tougher decisions, because there's nothing. I mean, you can't fail further, right? This is it, But when things are going well, there's so many possibilities, so many options to making the bet on what to invest, and we think this is probably will give us the biggest outcomes. Sometimes they're hard, and people have so many opinions, and you engage them to empower them to talk. But my experience, most times they want management to make the last call. Right? Because accountability is a hard thing. Everybody will be responsible for doing something, but not everyone is willing to be accountable for it. So that thing is hard, at least for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I always think about it in terms of, at some level, what we're doing here is a creative endeavor, and creative endeavors benefit so much from constraints, right? If we think of like in the art world, it's the medium you choose. If you're a writer, it's like, some folks just really need a really strict schedule to write on in order to get something done. And similarly for us in the tech world, as we're exploring spaces, especially when things are going well, right, and those constraints are a little bit lifted, then there's all sorts of questions that pop up and difficulties that arise. That's fantastic. I think the other thing that's really interesting about the role is working with your executive peers, and what does that look like? I'd love to get your take on, what is your approach to working with your executive peers? Armin, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I'd say it's a bit of a different relationship with the different leaders. I'd say the ones that are probably the most important for us is the relationship with sort of our CRO and the sales organization, as well as the CMO. And the marketing organization, because I think collectively, and actually I said the CFO, the CFO is where the constraints come in. So it's very important to have a good relationship there to understand. But I think the more, maybe that's the constraint side of it. The creative side is with the other folks, because I think that's where you're spending a lot of time in terms of understanding, hey, where's the needs of our customers evolving? Where do we think the market is going? How do we continue to be relevant in that sort of evolution 3-5 years down the line, to our customers in the marketplace, et cetera. So I think, a lot of that is obviously you're not going to be talking about specific feature level investments. So it's much higher level with them in terms of, hey, what's the thesis of where the customers are going, where we think the market's going, and what's our broader sort of investment philosophy with that. And so I think that's where we spend a lot of time. Obviously, there's a more tactical layer with them, which is like, great, if you build a product, but you don't market it and you don't sell it, you have a problem. So there's sort of the strategic level, where are we going 3 to 5 years conversation. And then there's this sort of ongoing conversation of, hey, this new product's coming out. What's the launch campaign for that? How do we enable our sales teams to sell that? That's the one direction from product out, if you will. And then there's the other direction from market in, which is like, hey, what's the sharp edges of the product? What's the top 10 missing, features or bugs or sharp edges or whatever? So it's really about creating a two-way loop, if you will, where it's like, we want to get the feedback in from the teams who are spending time with the customers in the field, but we also then want to be able to create a pipeline back out, which is like, we have to tell people when we're building new features or bug fixes or whatever. So I'd say those are some of the most important executive relationships for me.
That's great. Emily.
Yeah, I feel like I have the same answer in a different way in some ways, right? Like, I think that like I put down those relationships. It's like one of the most important things is like parsing other people's needs. So kind of listening and figuring out what, all of the needs of the different exec level and different departments, and then kind of taking that into your department and figuring out what work it is that's going to be built. This makes it sound very simple, but then it's like a managing of expectations that comes then after that. So managing expectations doesn't mean limiting. It's just like making sure that people know like that you are building something to solve that problem, or you are fixing that thing, or you're not, and why you're not. So I think that a lot of conversations come down to like, what we're not building or what we are building, and where it is, right? Like where it is on the journey, and particularly if something's like slow or is not going so well, those kinds of conversations are quite important to keep like kind of communication going, so that everybody kind of knows where we stand. Yeah.
Great. Elaine, what about you?
I agree. The one thing I want to add to is I'm a big fan of the team number one concept, which is documented in the 5 dysfunctions of a team by Patrick Lencioni. The team number one, that is really helped me as I transitioned from a VP to CTO as well. Basically, my team number one is my peers, the executive team working for the company, right? Instead of actually thinking my engineering team, that little organization. The reason being that is I have to think about how to think and operate at a company level and drive the progress there. So my collaboration is always trying to understand my peers' role and the responsibility and challenges they face. And I agree with Armin that it's the number one friend that I have to make is actually not my boss, not the CEO, it's actually the CFO. We're gonna figure out the budget first. And then I have to work well in the enterprise world where I previous came from is the CRO or the head of sales. And that's very important because I have to draw a connection with the users. The here is slightly different, in a consumer-based world, we have more way to better connect with users directly. So it's more of collaborating with the product to figure out what is the product roadmap, what is the product vision.
Nice. A quick follow-up. I mean, I feel like sometimes folks who aren't in executive meetings have a very different idea of like what goes on in those executive meetings versus what really happens. When you have disagreements, like what do those look like? Is it an arm wrestling match? Is it a crucible? Is it like how do those what have you found to work well in terms of influencing and or convincing folks off and changing their minds?
I'm happy to sort of kick this one off. What I generally feel is that, most disagreements either come from we disagree on the core premise, we don't have the same data, or we're working off of different constraints. And I think when you just get everyone in a room and sort of say, hey, here's my constraints, here's our investment thesis, here's where we're, we've made bets or where we're already, we have obligations we have to fulfill. I think once everyone kind of has that same data, all of a sudden I think you tend to see a lot of those disagreements. You might still be unhappy with the outcome, but you maybe don't disagree with it because you're like, okay, I can see how we're weaving the needle through this. I think most of those disagreements tend to feel like when it's like, oh, the sales team is coming at it from their constraint, which is, hey, this is what my customer is asking about. But then when you're like, okay, here's how my staffing works. Do you want me to take them off the feature you asked for or off the bug you asked for? You pick. Oh, okay, yeah, I guess I get it. So I think it's more about that.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's any different than any other department. It feels like, it's not like tech isn't special versus sales versus marketing in making those decisions when everybody's in the room together. It's about compromises, and it's about everybody having that information in front of them and what levers can you pull in order to reach your goals. And there's always going to be compromises, whether it's in the tech team or the sales team or whatever. And so once everybody understands that, and I think sometimes if there's an inability to reach a decision, I like to we just need to make a decision and we need to check in on it after X amount of time. Like that often arises where, you just have to go in a direction to see whether that direction is right or wrong, because, otherwise you're stagnant. And so a decision is better than no decision.
I agree with that. So the key thing here is to really build up the rapport with my peers to understand their perspective, the constraints of them, what's their goals, right? And I think it's important at the C team level, we're going to agree on what is the company goal that we all agree on, and what is each our own responsibility and goal to reach, help the company to reach help the team to reach that goal. Once you have the perspectives, it's much easier to work on the details and the individual decisions. From a tactical standpoint, I like and have brought this RACI, process, a framework to different places, and really helping, once you agree to, then you agree to who is owning this, who is accountable, who is responsible. It really helped. A lot of time when I see the conversation happen, it's not just the disagreement, it's really people don't know what role they are playing. When you're being the consultant, you think that you're actually responsible for the outcome, or you're being informed, you think that you actually should be consulted. And that's usually what the disagreement comes from. And because everybody's trying to help. And, we all high achievers, and that's why we get into the position we're in. So all of a sudden you have too many chefs in the kitchen. They just just go back to the basics and clearly define the roles and responsibility will help.
Awesome.
I actually have a good, if we have just another little bit on that, is like being early stage, 3 years in, like I've quite recently gone through the transition of a company where we didn't have high level goals set, that we were working on instinct. We were a small enough team that we could kind of figure out where to go next by just conversation. Like I've gone through that little kind of bump where, we really needed to put those processes in place. And so as soon as those processes were put in place where, we did have kind of higher level metrics and goals to work to, which I'm sure everybody, has experienced that, but when that's brought in, the difference that it made to all of those conversations and all of those kind of situations where you're trying to choose between these things, it just releases those discussions because you have something to base it around. So having seen it without and with so recently, it's kind of quite stark difference, if that makes sense.
No, I think you're spot on, and it feels like, if I'll add slightly to that, I feel like there's actually two pieces to it that I've seen that for us has been super impactful. Is one is a clarity of the vision and the outcomes you want to get to, but I think that's in some sense that's the what, if you will. This is what we're trying to achieve. I think the how. And I think for us, it was very important to articulate the principles of the company. And we, for a long time, they were internal only, eventually we published them publicly. But I think the how we get there is just as important, because that then becomes a bit of this tiebreaker. I think going back to our earlier discussions, you have to put the constraints in front of people. But if you don't necessarily agree on the what or the how, then there's many paths through the woods, if you will.
Yeah, totally. I think we have I'd love to get to some questions from the audience. So we'll do that for a little bit here. This one is, as a CTO, how do you lead without using authority? How do you influence a broad agenda across the organization by using persuasion as a tool in a bottoms-up culture? Who's got thoughts?
It kind of feels quite close to what we were just talking about in some ways for me, because, having a clear agenda, clear vision, mission, and goals set for the organization makes this less of a problem, because you don't need to lead with authority because it's something that's been decided company-wide already. So I think that's one thing I would say. And then again, it's that thing that if people aren't bought into the way that you want to, so say you do need to lead with authority and you want to go in a direction, and you maybe have like some pushback on that from your team, that you need to set out all of those compromises in the same way as you would at exec level, and show people why we need to make a decision one way or another, and encourage the team to kind of follow you on one direction until a such point that we have more certainty, so that people have to kind of buy into maybe a decision that they don't agree with until such time that like we can kind of come together and say, okay, this is the right way or this isn't the right way. That's how I feel about it.
Excellent.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add, but I think Emily's right. I think we touched on it already, but I think the biggest way, I think your role changes a lot, right? Which is like, in some sense, you have to get comfortable, like going back to the way beginning, that like, you're not going to make every technical decision, and the team's going to do things in ways you don't agree with. And that's okay, right? Like, you just have to get comfortable with that. And it's a hard thing to get comfortable with. I think what you have to become really clear what matters to you. Is it like how you do it, or is it where you get to that matters to you? And I think once you accept that your job is to really get to the business outcomes, then for me, where I spend a lot of my time is like, how do I cascade what the annual goals are? So it's like, hey, what are the fiscal 22 North Star goals for R&D? Let's create that clarity for everyone. And then for each of our product groups, have them cascade down, and and for that to be done by the teams, not by me, what their fiscal 22 goals are. But you make that a collaborative process. So you sort of influence it up front, so that as they're setting the goals, you make sure they're aligned to what you're trying to get to as a business. And then you just have to defer that they're going to make a bunch of execution decisions below that line. And you have to kind of give them the room and space to do that. And you might not agree with it, but that's okay. Yeah. As long as it gets you to where you want to go. Because I think if you try and micromanage or exert that type of hard influence over everything, I think it becomes, then it's like, why did you pay all these, highly paid smart people to come in and do this if you're going to micromanage everything they do?
Right. Exactly. I mean, I have to own the why, the directions, and I have to let go of the team to define the how. And we together can collaborate on the what exactly. What is the solution to drive the problem, to solve the problem, and depend on the initiatives. And I step in more on the what, but I have to let go of the how. There's no way. I can give inputs, and they can give me input on the why, what problem to solve with the directions. So we just need to be very clear on that roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, one of the mantras I keep repeating to myself is a line from Little Bow Wow and Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift, which is, if you ain't out of control, you ain't in control. It's just a way of reminding myself, it's okay. Just gotta let it go.
It's hard though. It's hard to get to be, comfortable about that. I'm not sure if I'm completely comfortable about that even now, but you just learn, to get better,
Totally. Our next question is, how do you maintain your technical expertise and ability to make impactful technical decisions when you spend most of your time on the personnel and business side of things? Elaine.
Yeah. I probably want to tweak this question a little bit. I want to chance. I read this question as the feeling that the sense of losing the technical expertise, at least from my experience, that's my journey. The thing is, you have to think about, I come over that is because I realize what is most important for me to help the team and help the company to succeed, and which is the business side of things. Personnel is important. It's especially important depending on what stage the company is. things I overcome that is, if the personal side I have to, as I grows and the team grows, I have determined, hire the VPEs and directors and help me to manage that piece, right? The business side, you can't get away with that. And I actually would highly encourage you to spend more time. The more you focus on the business side, the technical vision is better, for sure. The technical expertise, and this is another area for me to empower my team, to help me to get up to speed with the trainers, to get them to create a culture of innovation and curiosity, so they will continue to learn and share with me, or in the more group settings, what the new trend is, right? So help me to understand better and be able to connect the dots between that technical expertise, the new directions, to the potential problem that we can solve. And that's how I will frame it.
Great. Armand.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Elaine said is exactly right, and I think this is it's funny because this is a common, I'll call it concern I hear from as I'm mentoring folks on our sort of technical track, and I think there's this fear of like, hey, if I go from being an IC to like an architect or a principal engineer, like I'm going to be less in the weeds, I'm going to lose my technical chops, and so I hear this concern echoed in sort of different ways, and in some sense, I think going back to Elaine's point of view, it's like that's okay, like. Your role is different, right? Like if you ask me to explain the difference between Ember and React, I'm not going to be able to tell you, right? It's like, but in some sense it doesn't, like that's not what your job becomes anymore, right? It's like what matters is, do you have a fundamental grounding in the technology? If someone explains to you the high level differences between, the frameworks, or like, hey, should it be a message driven approach or a RPC driven approach or whatever, it's like, great, we can navigate the trade-offs and sort of have a discussion around the fundamentals, but the specific protocol, should we use Thrift over JSON over whatever, it's like, okay, well, that's kind of a decision for the technical teams. They're a lot closer to it. They should explore those nuances and kind of make the right decision. That's not really your job anymore. So I get the concern, I get the question, but in some sense it's like, if you're overly worried about that, then you're probably not doing the job.
Yeah.
Great. And Emily.
So like you're going to hire people who are better than you at all of these things, right? Like that's your job, is to hire people who are better than you at everything. So you're surrounded by people with this expertise, and your job is really just to kind of connect all of that together and make decisions based on what they say. And if I reference back to my previous life as a civil engineer, I think that what I learned in that role was that every single project that I did was so vastly different from the previous one that there was no training that could mean that you could do one based on the other. The whole thing was that like every single project I did, it was like, okay, well, now I got to learn about like, water supply. Now I've got to learn about like wastewater drainage, like it was just so different. And that was your job. Your job as an engineer is to like figure out that new technology and figure out that project and learn how to make decisions based on what you can learn. And I don't think that changes. I think it's the same for software engineering, but I think it's a little bit less obvious in my experience. But that's the reality, is that like every new project, it brings new technical problems and different solutions, and your job is to find people that can help you make those decisions, basically.
Great. We have a couple minutes left, so we'll wrap up with this last question real quick. For the aspiring CTOs out there, what skill would you recommend working on to prepare folks for the role of CTO? Elaine, you mentioned some of those things earlier, so we'll start with you.
I think absolutely communication, communicate upward, especially to your peers and the board. Communicate with your staff in terms of visions, and need to be able to answer the why translating to make sense for the technical folks, not just the business folks, understand the technical folks. So that's very important. For me, it's understand business strategy, the basic things. Please understand how to read balance sheets and understand revenue models. And surprisingly, those things that comes in fast and right away, you're going to jump onto it.
Yes, absolutely. Emily.
Like, so anything that takes you out of your dev world, I think is powerful. So, I kind of feel like it's like a looking up and out sort of exercise. You want to like grasp opportunities to work with other teams that maybe you haven't interfaced with before, try to figure out like every piece of work that you're doing, how do you figure out how to connect that to the value of the company, and really just kind of like try to, speak to people in the company to figure that out. So I think that that's really, really important. And then any opportunity that you have to lead or manage people, I think is really important. I know, Armin, you said that, you had kind of identified that as an area that like you didn't want to continue on that path. And I'm sure that you hired at some point like a VP of engineering or something like that like meant that you didn't have to do that. But I don't think that it means that you cannot avoid it, right? Like there's no way to avoid it. There's no way to avoid the people parts of things. And you can't accidentally be good at that, I don't think, or like it's hard to be accidentally good at it, like you have your first kind of personnel issue and you feel it and you go, okay, this takes such a level of delicacy and like subtlety that it requires experience. So grab onto any opportunity that is going to give you that experience.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I think I'd echo both Elaine and Emily. I think maybe getting a little crisper. I think one of the most impactful things I ever did was join a Toastmasters group. And I think people find it hard to believe, but I used to be terrified of public speaking. And now it's like basically my full-time job. So, I think that was a very specific skill that I worked to develop. And I had a great manager who coached me, and he was like, this is going to be the limitation of your career if you can't get over some of these communication things. So I think things like getting comfortable with public speaking, joining Toastmasters is really impactful. I think focusing on technical writing, I'm not saying you're going to be Hemingway, but I think your ability to clearly, precisely write down, here's a vision, here's a set of technical constraints, this is a business plan, right? Like getting good at that skill, I think is very, very important. And then I think maybe the third one, and it goes back to Elaine's communication, is this notion of, I'll call it code switching, which is, I can have a conversation around a feature with my lead engineer. That same feature I'm going to have to discuss with my head of marketing, to my head of sales, to my CFO, to an investor. And all of those are going to be at a very different altitude, very different level of complexity. And I think a lot of technical people struggle with that. They'll describe the same level of tech detail whether they're talking to another engineer or the CFO. And the CFO does not care. Right?
Yeah.
And so I think just practicing that of saying, hey, I'm going to take this feature, I'm going to write a doc that describes it to my fellow engineer. Then I'm going to write the exact same doc for my manager, then the same doc for my manager's manager, and just try that art of code switching of like, how would you describe this differently to the different audiences? What assumptions are you making about their knowledge, their level of depth? Because I think that's the biggest thing I see engineers mess up is they assume everyone's just as technical as they are. And then their audience looks like a deer in headlights because they're like, this guy's talking about the compression protocol and the wire or whatever. And like, I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. We are out of time. So let's wrap it there. Thank you, Armand, Elaine, and Emily, for your insights in today's panel. Also, a very big thank you to our audience for your questions. If you'd like to continue the conversation, head on over to the Staff Plus channel in the LeadDev Slack, where we will be hanging out for a little bit to answer a few more questions. Thanks again for everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time. Take care.